our very own resident, Doug Hempel, here to talk about his fabric art. And if you haven't seen it out across from the art room, you need to make sure you stop by on your way home. We'll see some pieces tonight. He's going to talk about kind of how he got started and how he does it, but please help me welcome Doug.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. My name is Doug Hempel, as she introduced me. My wife, Karen, and I moved into Oaknoll about 9 months ago, and we love it here. As most of you are probably aware by now, some of my artwork has been on display in the exhibit wall just down the hallway from here for the past month. A few weeks ago, I was asked to give a talk explaining how I got started in this hobby and how it all developed, so that's what I hope to do now. Although I was born in Cedar Rapids, my family moved to Aurora, Illinois, a western Chicago suburb, shortly thereafter. Growing up in the early 1950s, I can remember my brothers and I enjoying beautiful quilts handed down to all of us from our great-grandmother. I remember staying warm and cozy in bed during the winter months under the weight of these heavy homemade quilts pressing down on us. These quilts, I think, were made with what I think was horsehair batting. Does that sound right? Yes. Is that what they used? But whatever it was not the light, fluffy, weightless stuff they use now. They were bulky and literally weighed on you. And before they were packed away for the summer, we would sometimes use a quilt to drape over a card table to create a private little cave or playhouse for us to play in. The multicolored walls the quilts made seemed like beautiful stained glass windows in their crazy patchwork patterns. I loved them. I've always been fascinated and interested in art. I can remember my older brother and I, who frequently colored in picture books, one of our favorite pastimes. We'd love to lay on the floor in front of our immense console record player and listen to old classical 78s while creating colorful pictures with our crayons. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my parents purchased a set of the World Book Encyclopedia. I suppose this was considered to be an investment to help us do well in school. But in these books, I discovered the old masters of the art world. There were pages upon pages of classic paintings in full color, and I spent many hours paging through them and absorbing them. I loved the detailed woodcuts and prints by Albert Dürer, and I was especially fascinated with some of the examples of landscape paintings. One in particular, El Greco's dramatic Toledo in a Storm, had a profound effect on me. I gazed long and hard on it. After my siblings and I grew up and left home, my mom started quilting in her middle years, just as her grandmother had before her. Over the years, she produced several quilts for each of us, bed quilts, as well as wall hangings and table coverings. In 1968, I came to Iowa City to study music at the University of Iowa. I met my wife, Karen, in theory class. She was also a music major. And we got married right after graduation, and we have pretty much remained in Iowa City ever since. In 1992, my first nephew was born. Somewhere, maybe in a Christmas card we received or one of those holiday home magazines, I saw a nativity scene made entirely out of fabric. It gave me the idea that I could do something similar as a Christmas gift for my nephew. I've always been pretty comfortable handling a needle and thread. When I was about 8 years old or so, I asked my mom and grandma to sew up the stitching on my softball when the lacing was worn and the leather cover was flapping off. Both of them were too busy at the moment to help me out, so I simply took one of her largest needles, doubled up the thread, and sewed it up myself. Ever since then, I've always been able to patch up my own pocket holes and other small rips. Anyway, I borrowed a few appropriate fabric swatches from my mom and pieced together my first piece. So this was the very first thing I ever did. This is in 1992. As I said, this was given to my nephew as a Christmas gift that year. I thought it was pretty rough and basic, but I was reasonably content with how it turned out. In addition to the main fabric pieces, I used crewel thread for the thatched roofs and figures and made the stars and sheep out of French knots. For being a complete novice, I thought it was pretty original. It wasn't until several years later that I pursued another similar project. Later in her life, my mom developed severe arthritis in her hands, and she eventually had to give up doing needlework altogether. Since I had used some of her fabric in the past, she offered me the bulk of her remnants. Among her stash was a fabulous night sky print, which inspired me to try a second, more intricate nativity scene. I call it the Christmas story, as it has all the components of the Christmas narrative. Once again, I use crewel thread for the figures, the shepherds, the angel, the stable, and the tiny wise men on the distant hill. And again, I use French knots for the sheep. It seemed to work well. The angel is right in the middle. The wise men are way on the top of the hill. They're very tiny. The wise men hadn't come into the scene yet, so they're still on the way. But I was very pleased with how it turned out, and I decided to do a similar piece to complement it, the resurrection. During one of our fabric store runs, I came across a fabulous simulated rock print, which worked well for the tomb. I also found it pretty impressive in sky fabric, too. The simulated rock print inspired me further into creating a mountain scene. I've always been a mountain lover, and have spent most of my vacations in national parks, hiking and climbing. During this period of my life, I've made several trips to the Tetons of Wyoming. Using some of this rock fabric, my next piece was Springtime Along Jenny Lake. This piece I offered up for a church charity auction. So I no longer have it anymore. I followed this up with a second Teton scene, the Jackson Hole barn. This particular barn is a famous landmark in the Jackson Hole Valley and is often used in illustrating travel books and calendars. I used dark brown corduroy for the siding of the barn. I thought the raised ribbing of the corduroy fabric simulated the log siding for the real barn quite well. You probably can't see it very well, it's very dark, but the ribbings look just like logs, in my opinion. By this time, I hadn't yet developed a set protocol or technique. I was still just experimenting around with different ways of attaching the fabric to a stretched canvas. I've never owned or used a sewing machine, so all my pieces are hand-stitched. One of the main problems I first encountered was maintaining a clean edge. Some fabrics would fray and unravel quite easily before I could sew it cleanly over the edge. It was rather frustrating. On a few early attempts, I tried folding the edge over with an iron, but this was clumsy and only worked well for straight edges, not curves. Plus, the added second layer of fabric made it more difficult to put the needle through it. To do this with curved edges was nearly impossible. What I now use, I use an artist's modeling paste, which I dilute down with water. I paint the back side of each fabric piece to make the surface stiffer and more intact. This kind of acts like a starch and helps to keep the edges from unraveling. Originally, for my base, I used standard artist stretchers with canvas stretched over it, pretty much like a painter would use. This acts like a large hoop for sewing the fabric onto the canvas. When I finished a piece, I initially purchased ready-made frames, or I would cut and make my own frames to fit. What I now do is I just find frames in Crowded Closet or Goodwill or some other secondhand store. I can usually find excellent frames, cheaper than even making my own, and many are much fancier as well. One of the drawbacks of this, however, is if they're not the normal or standard sizes, which often is the case, I need to make special stretchers to fit the frames. So the size of each piece I now work on mostly depends upon what size frames I have on hand when they're finished. One of the hardest things for me is to simply draw an acceptable design on paper. I don't have an especially good imagination and usually have to find a model or idea somewhere that I like or feel that I can mimic or modify, and something that I think will work well with fabric. Once I finally have a design down on paper, I enlarge it at a copy center to the desired dimension. Then I trace it onto heavier poster board. From this, I cut each piece out individually. Each acts like a template for cutting the piece of fabric I need for that particular position. It's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle with individual fabric pieces sewn into the design. After cutting each fabric piece out, I then use a glue stick to anchor it in place until I can get it stitched onto the canvas by overlapping it onto another piece of fabric already attached. I just started doing this on my own and never realized it was an actual quilting technique known as applique. In most cases, I start sewing pieces beginning at the top and work my way down. The piece below usually overlaps on top of an extended edge of the one above. Exact placement of each piece is absolutely crucial. If I get off even slightly, it can alter the entire design enough that I may need to modify or even redraw a section to get it back on track. Another big challenge for me is sewing the pieces at the edges of the design, and especially at each corner. Because of the wooden stretchers, I have to push the needle at an extreme angle underneath the canvas and yet cleanly into the edge of the fabric piece above. I frequently use a surgeon's hemostat to grab the needle, but even then it's still pretty delicate work. It's also a challenge to sometimes find the exact color or texture for a piece of a design. Usually when I decide on a design, I have a vague general idea of what fabric I have on hand that will work for the majority of it. But if something is not the exact shade or tone or color that I want, I don't have the luxury of simply mixing colors to lighten or darken it to get the desired shade that a normal artist working with paint can. If I can't find exactly what I need, I just have to resort to what I can find and accept it for what it is, even though it may not blend in like I had hoped. I'll show you a few examples of these later. Karen and I will occasionally make trips to various local quilting shops seeking the perfect fabric for something I need, or maybe just to give me a special idea on a special print that I come across. But it can be a little frustrating when I don't find the right thing. To give me ideas for designs, I frequently peruse art sites online like Pinterest or magazines or other sources. A few years ago, when I worked at Ebel Music Company, a coworker from New Mexico owned a serigraph print of the Southwest artist Doug West, which he displayed at the store. So he had this hanging at the store. This is a relatively simple but striking work. It only required about a dozen different colors, and I discovered I had excellent matching colors and prints already in my palette of remnants on hand to create a fabric version of it. So that was my first model. This is my version of it. As I said before, I'm a mountain lover, and one of the views I especially love when we're visiting Colorado is the Longs Peak skyline as seen driving southwest into Estes Park along Devil's Gulch Road. If I were a millionaire, this is where I'd build a house. I'd see that every morning. Just about every peak you see above there I've climbed, and I've climbed Longs Peak many times. But anyway, I wanted to reproduce this in a scene of a fabric scene as a kind of commemoration for the times I climbed it. This is how it turned out. This is hanging outside the display, by the way, on the wall, if you want to look at it closer. I had several different sky prints on hand, so by putting a few of them together, I tried to simulate how the color of the sky was transformed from dark to light as the morning progressed. This was my first piece of Long's Peak, but because it is one of my favorite mountains, I've done about a half dozen more over the years. In 1989, I made a trip to the Grand Canyon with a group of people. Besides hiking in some of the classic areas of the South Rim, we camped a few nights in the Havasupai Indian Reservation, just below the famous Havasu Falls. And you may have seen this in various art travel books too. It's a very, very lovely piece. Anyway, several years after I had made that trip, I attempted another commemorative piece based on that photograph. This is how mine turned out. Again, this is one that's hanging down the hallway too. Excuse me. It was about this time that I got my first commission. A good friend of mine, the Trinity Church administrator, Andy Quilter, admired my work and asked me if I would make a couple of pieces for her to give as gifts for her children. Her family owned a cabin on a lake that they stayed at every year. She wanted me to try and create a scene of this cabin to commemorate their times together. I cautiously agreed, but since I'd only done a few landscapes before, I was a little skeptical that I could do it to her justice. I asked her to give me a description of it and possibly provide a photograph of the cabin so I could actually see it. I also asked her if there was any specific things about the place that uniquely identified it. She told me that they had an old rusted out boat they used as a flower planter, and they would frequently have a campfire going in the evenings. Over the next several weeks, I pieced together something mostly with the fabric I had on hand, and this is what turned out. Fortunately, she was thrilled, and I made a second one just like it for her other child. Several years later, when this person retired after working at Trinity for many years, I made a small, special piece which I gave to her as a gift for working at Trinity Church. Also around this time, we had an interim rector who served at our parish while a search committee sought out a new permanent priest. Ben was dearly beloved, and when a call was finally accepted by the new priest, it was hard to see him leave. We wanted to give him a special going away present, one that would remind him of this time with us. Many of you may be familiar with the work of the local scratchboard artist, Claudia McGehee. She is also a member of Trinity. In 2003, in honor of Trinity's 150th celebration, she created the design for a stained glass window, which was installed in the vestibule right before you entered the sanctuary. This is a lovely window. I got her permission to use her design to create a fabric piece to give to Ben. So this is my version that we gave. Not exactly a commission, more like a barter exchange, but a few years ago a good friend of mine did a sewing repair job on a pair of one of my favorite pants. As I mentioned before, I don't have a sewing machine, nor do I actually sew per se. Anyway, I offered to create a small piece for her in repayment. She asked me to do a scene of their home, and again, I was a bit hesitant, but I accepted the challenge. I took several pictures of their house and asked her for any specific or unique things about their home that made it special for them. She is an avid gardener, and she told me that she loved the rose arbor that climbed around her basement window. They also have an antique barn cupola roof vent set up as a lawn ornament in the backyard, one that came from the family farm. So there's their home. In the middle you see the cupola, and the cupola is pointing to the window with the rose arbor, but since it's fall, the roses are gone. But that's a close-up of the rose arbor in full bloom. So I tried to recreate those in the piece. And this is how it turned out. Again, I found French knots to be very useful there with little roses, around the window. The Iowa City Public Library used to offer an art purchase prize every year for original artworks submitted by local artists. I'm not entirely sure if they still do this, but back in 2017, I submitted 2 of my pieces, one of which they purchased. This one I call Dawn on the Diamond, another view of Long's Peak. Can you tell it's one of my favorite mountains? This one is a much simpler design, and I have to confess, it's not one that I'm particularly fond of. But if anyone wants to gain the prestige of taking home and hanging a Doug Hempel original in your living room, you can check this out at the library. As I mentioned, many of my subjects have been mountains I've climbed in the past, created mainly as commemorations. Here are a few more of them. This one is called Alpenglow on Capitol Peak. This is a small, simpler piece which I gave away as a close friend of mine. This one is called Uncompahgre Peak at Dusk. This one hangs in our 6th floor Benton building in one of the walls. This one I call Storm over Wetterhorn. This is another piece that resides on the 6th floor of Benton. This is St. Malo Chapel with Mount Meeker in the background. This is still one more piece that hangs in the hallway of our floor. This is called Purple Mountain Majesty, Mount Sopris. This is a small piece we usually have hanging in our apartment, but right now it's on the wall on the display. This one is simply entitled Katahdin. This is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. It's an example of how difficult it is to find an exact piece of fabric for every part of the design. I don't like the 3 pieces in the very middle. They're too bright and loud and don't blend in well with the surrounding pieces, but I couldn't find anything more suitable. Theoretically, if ever I could find something that would work better, I could theoretically rip out the 3 pieces and sew new ones in it. But it would be very delicate work, and I would risk damaging the other pieces around them, causing a potential chain reaction of replacements needed. At that point, by the time I got to those pieces, I was just anxious to get the thing done. So I reluctantly just accepted it the way it is. But I do love the way the top pieces kind of fade, in the distance, giving it a sense of true perspective. This is the photograph of the actual mountain that I patterned it after. So lots of times I will take photographs, especially the mountains, of views and stuff, and see if I can make a fabric version of it. This one is Long's Peak from Chasm Junction. I sold this piece to another friend of mine. It has another example of one weird, inappropriate piece that kind of sticks out in the middle. As you can see the white thing that looks almost like a glacier, which it's not. It wasn't supposed to be anyway. This one is called Teton Splendor. I've never climbed the Grand, but I have climbed a few of the surrounding peaks. Grand Teton National Park remains one of my favorite places. This is a small and relatively simple piece. This, again, is another example of how something changes. I was very happy with the sky print I found and the rock and the contrasting light and dark. But when I finally got down to the trees, my original model of the photograph I was going to do was going to be golden aspens around there without the lake. I bought about, I don't know how many, probably 8 or 10 different yellow prints and fabrics and stuff that I thought would work. None of them worked. They just looked like childish pieces and stuff, so I had to scrap that entirely and redraw the bottom. And so I just had these fabrics on hand, but it wasn't originally how I planned it. But that's the way it goes. For a while, I became interested in using the works of some of the old masters for my models. I love the style of cubism with its blocky, exploding planes, and it seems to work well with piecing fabric together. I came across a painting by Juan Gris, a Spanish turn-of-the-century artist. His still life with fruit and mandolin intrigued me, and I had discovered I had most of the colors he used already on hand. I wanted to try and simulate it and do a study on it, and I was pretty pleased with the results. Vincent van Gogh has always been one of my favorite painters. I love his work. I did a couple of studies on two of his famous paintings. The Harvest. Somebody, I think, on Benton 3rd floor has one very similar to this outside their door. And also the church at Auvray. However you say that. So those were my models for these studies. This is my version of the Harvest. This is my version of the church. For several years in the 1980s and 1990s, I worked at the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics as a respiratory therapist. I was usually assigned to work in the adult intensive care units, but occasionally I floated on the general floors throughout the entire hospital, giving breathing treatments to patients. When I did the latter, I loved walking through the hallways, admiring all the artwork displayed on the walls. It reminds me very much of the hallways here at Oaknoll. When I became more familiar with where they were in their locations, I developed favorite routes to take depending on the artwork display so I could pass and see them. One particular hallway held a Thomas McKnight print of his Italian Riviera. This print fascinated me, and the more I gazed at it, the more I saw possibilities for doing it in fabric. I love the detailed work, and this certainly offered that. I narrowed the scene down slightly and only did a portion of it, but it still remains one of my favorite pieces. This one again is hanging out down the hall. That one turned out very well. In addition to the mountains, I love old barns and rural landscapes. When Karen's folks lived in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, we would travel back and forth to visit them, and we would stay off the interstate and drive on the back roads, varying each trip to see as much different Iowa landscape as we could. We'd photograph any interesting barns we came across, especially dated old historical barns and round barns. At one point, there were nearly 100 round barns throughout the state of Iowa, and we took most of them. One of my earliest works was what I call Autumn Splendor. This was done back in 2012. It again is one of the most detailed pieces I've ever done, with all the tiny little turning trees, and it is still a favorite piece of mine. 10 years later, when I needed a new idea for a project, I thought about doing 3 more like it, one for each season. I did spring back in 2021, Summer Glory back in 2020, and Winter Peace also in 2020. All 4 of these are now grouped together and on display outside of our apartment. Collectively, I call them the 4 seasons. Another landscape I finished recently was Harvest Home. I still have a lot of lovely fall-like colors and prints on hand, and I wanted to incorporate a round barn for the variety at this time. On a few occasions, a special print or fabric will elicit an idea all by itself. Some things will just call out to me, this will work perfectly for such and such an idea. I had several small swatches of fabric that seemed to fit perfectly for an aquatic scene, tropical fish. This piece was really fun to do, and because of the more non-specific general placement of each fish. Positioning wasn't crucial. I had a lot of leeway and flexibility, so it was relatively easy and stress-free. Another whimsical piece is my Flatiron Fantasy, completed in 2017. The Flatirons are among the most famous geological landmarks of Colorado, and they lie adjacent to the highway just outside of Boulder. I've never climbed any of these, but we've driven past them on a number of occasions. But they just seem to be a fun model to try and simulate, but they also seem to be a little boring in and by themselves. In my box of fabrics, I had a really nice Starry Night sky print I hadn't used with anything yet, and I wanted to incorporate sometime. Again, like I say, I love detail work. I felt like it needed more pieces in the sky rather than just using a large swath of one kind of fabric. Somewhere I saw a whimsical design with curly-Q designs, which I thought might be fun to add. Well, it ended up being a major challenge. First, just to cut each piece out, and then to place them in exact position and still make it look right. And I'm still not really sure how I arrived at adding the whimsical moon blowing the wind over the irons, but somehow it just seemed to fit. I've also had some white felt fabric in my stash for a long time, and I got the idea of using it as piled up snow for winter scenes. Because it is quite thick, it almost gives a piece a 3D appearance. I also had a streaky ice blue print, which, to me at least, simulated a frozen river. Thus, winter scene was created. I gave this as a gift to another good friend. You may have noticed that I've also used felt for the snow on the evergreen tree in my winter Four Seasons landscape as well, and a few other pieces if I recall correctly. But the white felt fabric also worked well for the mustache of one of the kings, Journey of the Magi. This piece was also a fabric version of a Christmas card design that I made that same year. I printed my own Christmas cards for over 50 years, and this was the last one that I did. But I did this one in fabric. Shortly before we were married, Karen and I purchased a sculpture of a string quintet in the style of Cubism. We love this, and it still sits proudly on our bookshelf. I wanted to try and create a fabric version of it, but it was too wide to fit into any of the frames and stretchers I had on hand. So I condensed it down and made a trio out of it instead. It turned out reasonably well, I thought. One of my latest pieces is also in the style of Cubism. This was the first one I've done since we moved into Oaknoll. I call it Houses on the Block. It can be viewed in the hallway of our floor on 6th floor Benton again. This is the last piece. I just finished this a couple weeks ago. And it will give you an example too of how exact placement is absolutely crucial. If you look at it straight ahead and compare it with the frames, you can see that the buildings are kind of leaning slightly. When I didn't have the frame, I'm just working on the stretcher and sewing it. I thought I measured it all correctly and I thought I lined them up well. But once I got the left edge of the building started, I kept measuring to the right and adding the other buildings, and I didn't even know they were leaning slightly until I got the frame. But that's the way it goes. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with Far Side cartoons. You remember those? I'm a Far Side lover. There's one Far Side of a art curator who has a kirk in his neck. And all the pieces in his museum is tilted slightly. This would work well in his museum. Either that, or I could rename this, or also name this as Village of Pisa. So, the final piece I'm showing tonight is another very recent piece. seascape number 1. I intend to do a number 2 eventually. I wanted to try something new again, and like the mountains are to me, the ocean is to Karen, so this one is for her. Well, that's all I have. Does anybody have any specific questions or anything I can answer? Yes?
How many pieces have you done?
I've done 48 at this point.
How many hours did those 48 total?
I don't know. Cumulative, I have no idea. I've become pretty adept at sewing. That's the fun part. Yeah, each piece, again, the time it takes really depends on a lot of factors. It depends on how big it is, how complicated it is, how many small pieces there are. If they're big pieces, it goes pretty fast. But I can usually put on 2 to 4 pieces in an evening or an afternoon. But there's a lot of prep work that I hate doing too, which needs to be done. All the stretchers and stretching the canvas, and so it just depends. Most of the time, most pieces have taken maybe 2 to 3 months to complete. It depends on my schedule too, how busy I am, how much free time I have. So it really depends on a lot of things.
What type of thread do you use?
Yeah, that's another issue is the thread. I use plastic invisible thread, which is really awful to work with. It's very stiff, and but otherwise, if you use regular thread, it would show up. Invisible thread hides the edges, but it is very awkward to work with. Yes.
So, for example, where the blue water meets the brown sand,
Mm-hmm.
are you sewing plastic from the brown into the blue with stitch, or are you sewing along the edge, or how?
Yeah, usually, like I say, I work from top to bottom. I usually put the sky in, and then put clouds or whatever thing and go down. So most of the pieces are placed here. The next piece would be slightly overlapping it, and the next piece on that would slightly overlap that. There are some exceptions, like some of the waves in the middle. They're just on top of the waves to begin with. It just kind of depends on what you want to be kind of covered. But generally, I overlap everything, so it's always a piece over another one.
And then the thread goes.
The thread goes. It's hard to describe. I come up one side, go down the other, and then just. Anybody else? Yes.
So with the cloud, you put the whole blue and then the cloud is on top?
Yeah. The blue is all one piece of fabric, and then the cloud. But again, like when I'm working with the buildings, you have to. My poster board master design. I'll cut out, the top pieces of the tree or whatever, and then I'll stick pins on placement so I can get the piece exactly where I want it, and then try to put the template over it again, make sure it's lined up right, and then try to cut the next piece off and label it. But again, if I get off even a fraction of an inch, it can really change things really dramatically. I have to really be careful and get everything precise. Did I explain it, or?
Sure. So you draw out this scene on poster board, and
Right.
then you cut it out.
Right, I draw it on paper, usually a small, like 8.5 by 11. And then depending on what size frame or stretcher I want, I take to a copy center and blow it up. From that, it's still on thin paper. From that, I trace it onto poster board, and my poster board is my template master. I cut each piece of poster board out and use that over the fabric to cut off the fabric piece. So I can get pretty detailed in some of the intricate little design shapes and stuff. So it's kind of touchy sometimes. Yes.
So you're kind of having to cut it a little bigger and you're overlapping. Then how do you know that?
Yeah. So for instance, if I was putting this piece, well, the rough I put last, because I want those to overlap everything. But this piece would be here. This piece would overlap. This piece would extend a little bit, and this piece would overlap it, so I'd sew that up. The roof is by itself. In this case, they would be after I get the buildings on. I put them on so that they, they're the final edge that I want done. I'm not sure I'm explaining it correctly. Yes.
Are the fabrics the same weight?
No, it's just, that's another thing. I mean, there's some kinds of fabrics that are just really easy and work well, but not the color. If I have to find a particular color, I have to use whatever fabric it is. And some of the linens are really, they just fray and they just are really hard to keep a straight edge. But you just have to work with what you can. Yes.
Is the work on a stretcher?
Yes. Yes, I use like an artist stretcher, just like an artist would use, an oil painter or acrylic painter. It acts like a hoop that I put my fabric on and I sew it through on that. Right. Yes?
Do you get cramps in your hands?
No. I really enjoy it. Some people find it very tedious, but I find it very relaxing. I put on the CD and I just, I could do that for all afternoon or all evening. Yes?
This may seem like a really crazy question. Do you use thimbles on your fingers?
I do on one to push. Yeah, when you get some of these that are overlapped, like this is overlapped with, 4 different, some of the corners, you have like 4 pieces of fabric, sometimes even more, and it really is hard to shove a needle through that and to get it in the right placement. So yes, I do use a needle or a thimble to poke it through. Yes?
What does Karen do while you're doing that?
I have no idea. You'll have to ask her.
I help you move the drop knee.
My eyesight isn't the greatest anymore. When I'm sewing, my nose is like right on top of the fabric. And sometimes I'll drop a needle and then it's very, very hard. And I walk barefoot in my apartment, so actually it's pretty important to find the needle. Yes?
You mentioned making French knots on stars.
Yes.
Do you do much of that embroidery work on your pieces?
Just in the first pieces, it just depends on what I'm trying to create. The sheep just work well. I just thought, oh boy, French knots are perfect. Just make little balls, for the body. And the roses worked well, but most of the other things, I don't know what I would use for French knots. Occasionally, on the 3 kings, the kings, the tops of the crowns are French knot jewels. So it just depends on what I'm trying to create and simulate at the time. But I don't use French knots a lot, but they're kind of fun. Anybody else? Well, then I want to thank you for letting me share my artwork with you tonight, and a special thanks goes to David Jansen and Lindsay Moore for their help in organizing this and getting me set up. I also want to thank Dick and Nancy Bloom for their immense efforts in hanging the display. They just put in probably about 4 or 5 hours to get that stuff hanged, so I really appreciate their work. And if anybody thinks of other specific questions or anything, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'd be happy to talk with you more in depth if you want. Okay? Thank you.